Welcome, everyone. As you're joining us, we'll give folks just a couple of minutes to move from the waiting room into the webinar, and then we'll get started. All right, thank you everyone for being here today. Welcome to our webinar, Principal Leadership in a Virtual Environment. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Paltz-Stevenson. I'm the Director of Educator Community Partnerships at Digital Promise. And with me today is Angela Hardy. She's our co-host and will be moderating our panel. Angela is a researcher at Digital Promise. Before we get started, I'm going to ask Rochelle Herring, who is the Senior Program Officer in Education Leadership for the Wallace Foundation, to bring some greetings from her team.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Rochelle Herring. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Wallace Foundation. At Wallace, we deeply understand the value of the principalship, and for 2 decades, we've invested in research in education leadership to help strengthen policies and practices from the field. In the last several years, we've commissioned extensive research on what we call comprehensive and aligned principal pipelines. They are comprehensive because they cover the span of activities needed to shape and support principals, including leader standards, hiring, preparation, and on-the-job support. Research tells us that these pipelines result in effective school leaders, which in turn results in significant gains for students. And at the end of the day, improving student learning is what we're all here to do, right? So now during the COVID-19 pandemic, the principalship looks so different than it did pre-pandemic. School is happening both virtually and in person, and principals must ensure all students learn and thrive in both environments. These past 20 months, we've seen principals move mountains to do so, but not without some struggles and lessons learned along the way. So how can principal pipelines help us find, develop, and support a core of new principals who are well prepared for this challenge? This report from Digital Promise gives district leaders and decision makers some important recommendations to consider. These recommendations are aimed at helping principals provide high quality, equitable learning in a virtual environment, or what Digital Promise calls powerful learning. I wanted to say powerful learning and not all that other stuff, so forgive me. Powerful learning, I love that. The authors took a close look at the 7 parts of a principal pipeline known as domains and provide important considerations for district action in each one. We know there's a lot more research to be done on this emerging topic, but we are so excited to offer some early learning because our students and our school leaders need support now. So back to you, Stephanie. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. Before we get started, we want to tell you a little bit about Digital Promise. So at Digital Promise, our mission is to accelerate innovation in education to improve opportunities for all learners. And this means closing the digital learning gap, not only in access, but also in participation and in powerful use. Digital Promise invests at the intersections of these stakeholder groups, educators, researchers, and developers, because we know that to realize technology's full potential, we must focus on amplifying human capacity. And we were very excited that this report allowed us to really work at that intersection. To accomplish these goals, we believe in the power of networks, the sharing of stories from the field, support and investment in research, and an engagement in lifelong learning. So in the next hour, as Rochelle mentioned, we'll present this new research report from Digital Promise that's been commissioned by the Wallace Foundation, in which we set out to define what high quality, equitable learning looks like in a virtual environment, and to suggest how school district leaders can develop principals who can lead their schools to this type of learning. We developed the recommendations in this report by conducting 2 research activities. First, we reviewed existing research on the intersections of school leadership, virtual learning, equity, and the 7 domains detailed in the principal pipeline. Second, we conducted interviews with leaders from 5 school districts. This report and this webinar highlight stories from school leaders about how they've considered how the virtual environment influences principal leadership. And research has shown that it is not simply the same role in a new environment. The report also builds upon the research of the principal pipelines, which Rochelle has briefly described for you. Digital Promise explored what principal pipelines might include to support leaders working in virtual environments. The resulting report provides research-based considerations for how to build these comprehensive, aligned, and equity-centered principal pipeline that prepare and support leaders to work in these virtual contexts. Because this research is still emerging, we want to recognize that we're bringing together what is known and applying it to a new area that's not explicitly in the research. In today's webinar, we're going to discuss leader standards, pre-service principal preparation, and the hiring and placement of principals. This session will be recorded and posted to the Digital Promise site for your future viewing. So let's begin with a summary of the report by talking about powerful learning. These principles are built upon decades of learning sciences research, and they guide educators to design experiences that provide opportunities for students to really deeply engage in their learning while using technology in ways that contribute to closing the digital learning gap. Powerful learning means that learning is personal and accessible, authentic and challenging, collaborative and connected, and inquisitive and reflective. These sets of principles do not work in isolation, but they're synergistic and mutually supportive. For the benefits of powerful learning to be realized, Digital Promise believes, based on a decade of experience and research with schools, that school leadership must take an active role in the definition, promotion, and maintenance of powerful learning. In the virtual context, we view powerful learning as the product of school leadership, inclusive access, and meaningful use. In our report, we represent this relationship as an equation. Starting here with the last factor and working backwards, meaningful use describes how technology is used, not simply as a means to delivering supplementary materials, but as a means to helping students achieve learning goals or enabling previously impossible interactions. So really transformative use of education or of technology. Inclusive access closes the digital learning gap with reliable access in school and wherever else it's needed. And that's to the device, to the internet, and to the supports that enable every student to meaningfully participate. And of course, technologies for powerful learning do not implement themselves. Effective leadership is essential. And in this equation, we use the multiplication symbol deliberately to make it clear that if any of these 3 factors is 0, the chance for powerful learning with technology is also likely to be 0. In our research on the school leadership factor in the equation, we considered 3 key questions regarding what is involved with developing principals who have the skills and the expertise to lead in a virtual context. We asked, what does a principal need to know and be able to do to effectively lead in a virtual context? And we found that principals need specific skills and expertise, including but not limited to those related to data privacy and security, selecting digital resources, community engagement in a virtual environment, and a new level of systems thinking with agility. And that's all a different application than it is in the traditional face-to-face environment. We asked what on-the-job supports principals need, and we found that they need support for innovation and risk-taking and the value of collaboration in those supports. And we asked what conditions promote the development of a large range of a large cohort of principals who are effective leaders in this virtual context. And we found that some of the key enabling conditions are having district leaders who are visible in the virtual environment, professional development curricula that's rigorous and responsive to the needs of the virtual environment, and hiring practices that offer authentic opportunities to demonstrate specific skills in virtual leadership. We then turned our attention to the domains of the principal pipeline, and for that discussion, I'm going to pass the microphone to Angela, who's going to introduce our panelists and facilitate our discussion. Angela?
Thank you, Stephanie. I am thrilled to be here with you today to introduce our 3 panelists presented here in no particular order. So with us, we have John Seiler from Digital Promise. He is a research associate on the Learning Sciences research team, where he uses his knowledge of software tools to design innovative data collection, analysis, and reporting techniques, and also leverages his writing skills on various proposals, reports, and literature reviews, including the report that we are discussing here today, which he is a co-author. John's research focuses on emerging forms of teacher and principal professional development. He is especially interested in how these new opportunities are influenced by technology and active learning. Also with us here today, Matthew Gavin began his career in education as an elementary teacher more than 20 years ago. Since joining the team in Mineola School District, he has served as an elementary and middle school principal, director of pupil services, and director of technology before assuming his current role of deputy superintendent. He works with district personnel to create new models for professional development that leverage the power of technology so that teachers can learn with and from each other for the betterment of all students. And finally with us here today is Renee Sanchez, who is in his first year as superintendent of Champlain Valley School District in Vermont. Previously, Renee served as assistant superintendent of operations in South Bend, Indiana, and as a principal in Houston's Cesar Chavez High School. In South Bend, as an assistant superintendent for operations, he created the new teacher training monthly series focusing on equity and universal design for learning, coordinated moving to a new HRIS system and to digital personnel records, and also spearheaded implementation of Wi-Fi in district school buses. This action led to South Bend schools bridging the digital divide during the pandemic and to recognition of the district in local, state, and national news. His commitment to interacting with the community as principal of Chavez High School helped the school win the Houston School District's Family and Community Engagement Award for 4 years. And Renee is currently enrolled in Indiana State to conclude his PhD. So I will now facilitate a few questions for each of the 3 first domains in the report, starting with leader standards. And I'll start with a question for Matt. Given the unique strengths, needs, and special characteristics of your district, how did you decide upon the leader standards that you currently have in Mineola?
Well, to be honest, I'm so happy to be here today. Thank you, everyone, for putting this together. I think it's an important conversation to talk about developing the principalship. And, you know, after watching the heroic efforts many of our principals underwent over the last 18 months. But to get to your question, we in New York State had a law passed in about 2011, the 2011-2012 school year, that said all of our principals now needed to conform to what was known as the APPR law, the Annual Professional Performance Review Law. And what happened when the law first came out, it was pretty poorly written. It had some convoluted ways to take student data into both teacher and principal evaluation. And many of our districts were focused on trying to find something comprehensive that would also comply with what the law said. Nobody sat down and had an important conversation about what are we actually looking for. People in New York State were really worried about how do we comply with what the state is asking us to do. So we chose the principal rubric devised by Kim Marshall that was originally adopted in 11-12. It was widely adopted in our local districts, and it was global to cover a wide range of competencies and skills, none of which had to do with a pandemic, which is very interesting when you think about it now. So that's how we went about choosing it. And that is the current system that we are employing at the time.
Thank you. I want to pose the next question to John. In the research report that you co-authored, how well did practitioners feel their leader standards reflected common responsibilities for leaders, and specifically in virtual environments? So this could be data governance, instructional design for virtual learning, things like regularly engaging stakeholders and community in virtual learning or systems. So John, could you share with us how practitioners felt about the standards once they shifted to leading virtual environments?
Definitely, yeah. Some of those, it's interesting. Immediately, you know, we've just begun the panel questions, and already the topic of the pandemic has been breached. And I think that's very telling as to where people's minds are right now, and definitely where the literature is in terms of kind of realigning those virtual standards to instruction in a virtual setting. And what we found in the literature and through sort of personal conversations with people who are doing this work is that there is a lot of potential for alignment out there. There are things embedded in current leader standards that can certainly be adapted to virtual environment. Now, it's not going to be a perfect transition, old understandings of what data governance means, for instance, or what data privacy means, are definitely going to take on a new meaning now that so many students are online. In some places, all students are online. And it also has implications for what leaders are expected to do. In the pre-pandemic world, you can expect sort of data security or data governance to be the purview of, let's just say, one technology coordinator. But now, and you'll have to excuse our fourth panelist up here, our fourth little furry panelist on my desk here. You would expect, data privacy or data governance to be the purview of one, let's just say like information officer, but now suddenly it becomes the ownership of the entire kind of principal or administrative team. And that also requires a shift in what we see in leader standards. I'll briefly touch on another thing that was very surprising in the literature was how much principals and principal supervisors talked about sort of the non-technical skills, the softer interpersonal skills like empathy, collaboration, even things like flexibility and resourcefulness, how important those skills were for principals. And just how, that's not necessarily something you'd see in your coursework as a principal in training, but something that was definitely relevant for a lot of principals as they kind of navigated the new standards that they found were relevant during the pandemic.
Thank you, John, for that. I now want to bring Renee into the conversation and ask you, considering the insights and feedback of community stakeholders about their needs for virtual learning, how might your district's leader standards evolve in the future?
Sorry, I was muted. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very excited to be a part of this panel so that we can, learn from one another and then we can share out to everybody else. From my time of being a principal, I've learned quite a bit about the need to listen and to visit with the community on a regular basis about many different topics. So now as a superintendent, my board expects me to be out there listening to things that are going on, whether it's stuff that would have been happening anyway or stuff that would have been happening as a result of the pandemic. But it's so important because if we listen to the community, we know what the community is asking for. And over time, it's really going to include improved student engagement and belonging. So here within Vermont, we have a lot of local control. So school districts can choose how they implement principal and teacher appraisal. So for teachers, we use Charlotte Danielson, and for principals, we're using the Professional Standards for Educational Leaders, or PSEL, so that way we have a strong idea of what the core components are, but we've added a few more topics to it. So for us, it's going to be important to recognize that education as it existed isn't coming back per se. And so we have to figure out how we're going to deliver the instruction, deliver the curriculum, and make sure that we're able to assess whether the students are learning towards the standards. So that being said, if we're going to incorporate virtual learning as part of that, we have to make sure that we're listening not only to the students, not only to the teachers, but to the principals, but also to the community. How is that best going to be affected if we are moving towards that? Because moving forward, there's going to be a lot of different ways that we're going to involve virtual learning, not just because of the pandemic, not just because of quarantining, not just because of snow days, but lots of other opportunities. So I think for us, within that particular rubric, We're going to be looking at, we're going to make sure that we're looking at equity, making sure that principals understand what that looks like, whether it's equity in access, equity in opportunity, making sure that they are the ones who are working with the teachers and the families in providing access to the curriculum, either at home or at school, because for a lot of our kids, even though they may have a computer to take home, they don't have the access, or they're still using DSL or maybe other kind of satellite Wi-Fi that's not as strong as broadband. And being in the mountains of Vermont, we know that oh too well. And so we have to make sure that, so between equity and cultural responsiveness, instruction and assessment, and supervision and evaluation. So they have to know what these terms mean, whether or not things are synchronous or asynchronous, whether or not this is best delivered using an LMS, Google Classroom, or some other platform. And then knowing that we're going to be coming out of this a different system, principals need to be able to understand that as we're looking at our students and as we're looking at instruction, or we're looking at other initiatives, that we're looking at it with an equity lens or a trauma-informed lens, because everybody has been affected in some way, shape, or form. So knowing that, we have to make sure that we're looking at our evaluation systems the way we did before, but with that extra level of, if we have to move to virtual instruction, or we have a school that's dedicated to virtual instruction, how are we making sure that it's fair for everybody?
Thank you for those insights. I want to close out our conversation for now on this first domain of leader standards by inviting each of our panelists to share in 30 seconds or less the one takeaway or lesson learned they would like audience members to keep in mind as they move forward with redefining the role and responsibility of a principal in virtual learning in any order.
Well, I mean, I can tell you that you have to be comfortable with ambiguity. I think, any leader over the last 18 months, you have learned that, things that were done in education a certain way for a very, very long time needed to be rethought quickly. And I think that comfort in ambiguity and that centeredness on keeping the child or the student, at the center of everything that we do. I think on the Friday before we ended up going home for the next 3 or 4 months, we made a plan to make sure that we all had a teacher talk to at least every child and every parent in every home in the first 2 days that we were going to be home, to make sure they're safe, they had access to what they needed access to, and figure out how we could help them. And that went from Wi-Fi, if they didn't have a Wi-Fi access, we were able to provide that, all the way down to making sure they knew where they can come get meals if they needed to. So that responsibility turned on a dime, and I think that you have to be comfortable with making decisions on the fly when working with a well-intentioned group of district leaders, building principals and teachers, and emotional support personnel as well, to make sure that you're making the best decisions for everyone. And I think that ability to innovate is also very, very important.
Thank you.
I can go next, John, if that's okay.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so first, that one size didn't fit all or doesn't fit all in traditional education. So one size doesn't fit all in virtual education, or even less so, because now you can really truly get into the whole concept of learner variability. And so when you talk about personalization or even proficiency-based learning, you need to be able to understand who's in your classroom. So if in your classroom you provided just one lesson and you expected the students to figure it out themselves, or the scaffolds were kind of there, well, that's not going to work in a virtual environment. We need to be able to be sure that students have that access and they understand what is needed of them from the get-go, because if they're in the classroom, they can kind of get some feedback. In the virtual classroom, they may not be able to. And then finally, it's just that schools are now, before schools were kind of tacitly the community centers, but now the way it is, schools are responsible for feeding people in the community. They're responsible for vaccinating people. They're responsible for providing mental health. Schools have taken on the role of being the one stop for many different communities. So that means that we all have to work harder, but we should also end up getting some more engagement from the community as a result.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I'm so glad everything that I was going to mention that featured prominently in the research was already mentioned by the two of you, Matt and Renee. So so glad to hear that that's top of mind for the two of you as well. Just wanted to kind of follow up on what you said, Renee, about community engagement. A lot of the work that we did in the report was actually trying to think about new ways that schools can open up and involve their community when it comes to promoting virtual environments and virtual learning, because understandably, this is a new landscape for all of us, teachers and parents alike. And so trying to get them involved and get them in the room when it comes to explaining and planning what our virtual learning should look like and can look like, getting parents and community members involved is definitely top of mind, and can kind of ease any concerns that parents have when they're navigating this new landscape. And so we found that just involving community stakeholders not only results in just a better designed implementation, but also kind of helps community members be on board when that implementation does occur.
Yeah, I loved in the report that it talked about breaking down barriers that existed from before, because I know that one of the reasons that I was successful is that I was able to have parent coffees, but I had parent coffees, set day of the week, but people always came. We'd still have a lot of people, but people who worked at that time couldn't attend. Whereas now people can either see it on YouTube, they can see these meetings on YouTube, they can participate via Zoom, because they can be at work and listen on their headphones. So it is definitely a new world for community engagement.
Definitely. And yeah, I think that's a perfect example of breaking down barriers and having technology allowing us to involve community members in a way that wasn't happening or was happening on a much more limited basis before.
Thank you. Thank you for that, all three of you. And I want to shift gears now to bringing up domain number 2, which is high quality pre-service principal preparation. So basically, how do we prepare future principals to meet these new leader standards for shifting roles and responsibilities in virtual learning? And I want to start by posing a question to Renee. How do you think we can ensure that principal preparation coursework includes the types of skills and competencies that principals need to be able to integrate and align virtual learning in an overall program of high quality instruction?
So thank you, Angela. So first, as a district, we need to make sure that our mission, our vision, and our values are aligned first, so we can begin this process of integration and alignment with virtual learning. Then we need to make sure that our current principals have the specific skills to lead in the virtual environment, and it would also be helpful if they have it in the regular environment. So for us, once we have our principals ready to go, we can start building the relationships with the local, whether it's higher ed institutions. We also in this area in Texas, they were called educational service centers, where there was professional development for principals and for teachers, so that way it's important for them to have that on their regular training schedule as well. But in building the close relationships with the higher ed institutions, and like in this case in Vermont, we have several of our district people who are on the staff, teaching there already. So we should be in a good place to influence the principal preparation work. So I can't emphasize enough that school district leaders school leaders as well as district leaders need to be agile and adaptable. And so especially in the world of technology and virtual learning, between the changes that can occur due to learner variability and the changes that can occur due to software updates or technology companies being purchased or platforms no longer being on the buy board or for the state or district, as leaders, we need to be vulnerable to that change so we can help the entire system negotiate how it will be different moving forward. So we have to be, as a superintendent, I need to make sure that my principals have access to trainings on data and security, or data privacy and security, being able to select the proper resources, if it, whether it's a software or something that's downloadable that they can provide for all of their students, making sure that we're involving the community in determining all the different pieces that need to go into the principal learning. But I think the final thing that's the most important, that we, as whether it's the school or it's the district, is understanding that all of this lives within a system. And so if we have the ability to say, all right, our principals are going to need to be able to do this. Well, what are they going to do with this once they start working with their teachers? And the teachers, what is it going to look like when they start working with their students? And then what are the outcomes that we're expecting at the end of all of this training? So I think it's critical to make sure that we have this learning opportunity for our current principals, and then our future principals, whether we're training them or they're getting trained by a local university.
Thank you. I would love, John, to hear a bit from the research report on what the participants who were interviewed, the principals and the district leaders, felt was most valuable from their preparation programs that they did attend during the adoption of virtual learning.
Yeah, for sure. It was interesting hearing about what came up when we talked to principals and when we reviewed relevant literature and what didn't come up. Something that came up a lot, and I touched on it earlier, was just a lot of these soft skills. We've heard both Renee and Matt also mention it, just like a real focus on adaptability and willingness to accept uncertainty while leading. And there are a whole plethora of responsibilities that go along with that. Being kind of involved, talking to your teachers, understanding what are the challenges that they're going through. That requires a type of empathy, I think, especially, and it's a type of empathy that is perhaps less intuitive or more difficult to maintain in a virtual environment, and getting the ability to build those skills was something that was really important for a lot of new principals during the pandemic. And then another thing that I was interested to learn more about was just a desire and an appreciation of just taking time to understand the technology. What are the tools that our teachers are using? What does that look like in the classroom when something goes wrong, or something unexpected happens? What does that look like? And what are the common advantages and disadvantages of the tools that we're using in the classroom? Gaining that understanding and building that understanding, particularly not as much for new principals, but perhaps principals who have been around a while and are used to things happening in an in-person environment. Those were the kind of skills that were tougher to build, but definitely led to, as I mentioned before, some of that increased empathy with the teachers who are teaching in a virtual environment, and an increased understanding of what's actually going on in a virtual learning environment. So, and then I think the last kind of important pre-service preparation thing that I'd like to touch on would just be an increased understanding of the context of students, basically. And this is another kind of empathetic portion. You can see that this is starting to come up a lot, but obviously principals are focused on the needs of their staff and teachers. And as virtual teaching has sort of came to the fore during the pandemic, we saw that teachers or principals had the same access to their students as their teachers did. It was just they were on the other end of that Zoom call during the classroom observation. They're just another little box in that grid. So sort of being able to see and take advantage of the access to students in that way was kind of a final skill, I guess, and a final point of development that I wanted to touch on here.
Thank you. And now I want to give Matt a chance to respond to these comments and share, where your thoughts may converge or diverge with the other two panelists. Matt, considering the strengths and needs of your district, what would the ideal pre-service preparation program look like moving forward?
Well, I think an ideal program would have to talk about the different frames of what leaders are asked to do. So, when I think back to my own pre-service program, the book that comes back to me all the time, along, Peter Senge was one, but Bowman and Deal's Frames of Leadership comes back to me all the time. The idea that we need a political frame, a human resource frame, a focus on relationships, what symbols a leader stands for when they do their work, how in front are they of their people and of their community, and then how do you best structure it. So, a lot of what Renee and John have said would help me build an ideal pre-service program. I think one of the things that we were very successful with, we have a very innovative culture here. We like to push the envelope, and our teachers are very used to that. So I think one of the things I would ask for is leading an innovative culture series of courses. Like how do you ask your potential future leaders to say, look at the system as it currently exists, and what would you do to make it better? And I think that has to be, essential component to developing a leader's confidence in trying something new. When I think back to my own, there was a lot of focus on what a manager does. How do you manage? It talked a lot less about leading and a lot more about managing. Both Renee and John talked about the technology systems. As the former technology director, all the complaints prior to the pandemic used to come up my way, and they still come up my way when something doesn't work. And you really need to understand the systems and how much a well-oiled machine helps things innovate and do a better job. So for example, if you don't have to worry about how to use Zoom or how to use WebEx and using the poll tool or something like that, and our teachers are familiar and comfortable with it, that helped us lead to an entire PD system that we built on our own. We crowdsourced PD during the pandemic and asked all of our teachers to do a 5-minute little video on a tool that they liked that was very informative, and then we put them in a library and we shared them out. And then it greatly expanded how the types of tools that we were using, how were you using them, and then of course we looked at it from a systematic way and make sure that we're supporting data privacy, those kinds of things. I think the other thing a pre-service program would need to focus on is how do you establish relationships for success? And I mean relationships with your faculty, relationships with your students, relationships with your parents. If you are a principal, relationships with central office. How do you make sure that you're aligned with the district goal, with district goals and district mission and vision? I think a focus on relationships is extraordinarily important. The last component that I would focus on is the establishment of safe and reliable data systems. How do you make sure that what you know about where your school is? And in a virtual environment, that is so critical, right? So, I had the ability to pop into any class I wanted to pop into at any time. And I did. And, I know I was a little box, but we asked questions like, hi guys, how you doing? Is everything good at your house? We would have these little conversations, and it was a wonderful, wonderful bit of feedback. And for some of our younger students, we got feedback from the parents too. Right from right behind them, the 4-year-old in pre-K, mom and dad or somebody was there a lot, helping them log on and everything. So that group, that ability to use this virtual environment to provide feedback is extraordinarily important. And then last but not least, know the law. If you're in pre-service program, you need to have a healthy conversation about what your school law climate is, how it impacts what you do. And I don't mean just law, I mean like regulations and everything else. I mean, I did not have any courses in epidemiology, yet I feel like I could probably teach one now. So I think that was very interesting in terms of, like, what are your regulations? How does it impact, not only your virtual environment, but your in-person environment as well.
Thank you so much to our panelists for these insights. I want to move us along to the third domain. Domain 3 is around selective hiring and placement of principals. And for this domain, I'm going to pose a question and open it up to any of our panelists to jump in. And that question is, how can hiring processes provide opportunities for candidates to demonstrate all of these competencies and skills that we've been talking about up to this point for addressing equity and virtual learning challenges?
Well, I think some of the ways that are that I guess can be done is if the candidates have been trained to create portfolios, whether they're actual portfolios that they can hand over and allow people to see artifacts of what it is that they've done, or even better, if they've been able to create a digital portfolio of all the things that they've done, including videos, including other recordings, that they could show that this is how I've addressed equity. This is how I've evaluated, and I guess you probably couldn't do that, but this is how I've worked my way into classrooms where I was just there to observe, as opposed to evaluate or appraise, just to ask questions of the community. And then if you're a person who is like, we're going to be holding several town halls over the next few months, you can include links to the town halls where you're involving the community in these processes. And then I guess another scenario would be is if you're getting to the point where you're interviewing for the principal, putting them in front of teachers, putting them in front of community members in the virtual environment, and either having them lead a training or just be comfortable answering questions in the virtual environment, so that way they recognize that this is a skill that you now need to have in order to lead these schools.
And Renee, I really liked that you led with that portfolio, leading with demonstrated examples of recordings of artifacts like that. In the literature, we see districts increasingly moving away from a credential reliant, something that's a focus that's too narrow on credentials alone. And while we recognize that some credentials are certainly important and recognize a development of skills and an investment of time by the applicant, that those credentials are best supported by, as you said, artifacts or opportunities to demonstrate, or that they have demonstrated the skills that they would need to exercise while leading a virtual learning environment. And it was interesting to see all of the ways that those opportunities presented themselves in interviews or opportunities on the job, like you mentioned, getting them in front of a classroom, getting them in front of staff, seeing how they would respond in situations like that.
I think for us, one of the things we hired 2 brand new principals the first year of the pandemic. So one of our principals was brand new, and one of our principals was out on maternity leave and came back to this. So, we worked to integrate our principals very quickly, in an unusual circumstance, to say the least. And I think one of the things that we found that was critical to the success of both of our principals was their ability to listen and their ability to communicate relentlessly, and to turn that listening into, a message that made sense that resonated with their faculty, and a message that made sense for their community. And I think we did it we had I would probably say the first month we went virtual, I think we met every day at 4:00, and we met every day to talk about what were they hearing, what were they learning. And that constant level of support among and between each other, they did a lot of conversations and text messages and phone calls. What are you doing for this? What are you doing for that? I think that was a key thing. But for us hiring, one of the things we saw in both candidates, not knowing that this was coming, was their focus on, how do I take the mission of our district and make sure that, my everyday work embodies that mission. And both of the candidates and both of our who are still principals with us today, they were successful because they were able to take that and put it into practice very quickly. And they're also incredibly bright, driven, and dedicated, student-centered, compassionate leaders. I'm sure I'm leaving out some adjective that I would like to throw in, but for the most part, they were successful because they were listened, and they were smart and confident enough to adapt on the fly. And that's what we liked about them when we interviewed them. It's what we loved about them after the pandemic, and it's why they're successful right now.
So one other thing that I would like to add is, I guess, also being really upfront with the applicants, and having the conversation that for a while there was talk about Zoom fatigue, or being online fatigue. Well, it's now the normal. And it's a fatigue because you actually have to be on screen. You have to be paying attention. You can't be really truly multitasking because you have to give your time to the event. And as a result, the day may get a little bit longer. You're going to be a little bit tireder because you're having to sit and interact via Zoom or Teams or whatever the case may be. So it's definitely changing how education is going to be provided in the short term.
Thank you for those insights. I think to close out this domain, we talked about hiring, but I also want to address placement. And I'll open this up to any of you. Considering placement, what processes would you think should be in place to ensure that principals are well matched with the virtual learning communities they will serve?
I think you have to take a look at the candidate's credentials and a candidate's experience and background and try to match that with, the school setting or the component setting of its school that makes the most sense. And I think one of the things we did with our two new principals was we took a look at one of our principals had extensive experience in high school and middle school, and that was the person we put ultimately as our middle school principal. She applied for an elementary job that we gave to another candidate who had more of an elementary experience, including redefining how we were assessing, redefining assessment criteria for the elementary grades. And I think that to us was very intriguing. So their experience matched where we wanted to go with either that building or that age level band. And that for us made sense because you want to make sure that you have all the right pieces in the right place. And I think that's what makes a healthy and successful district. Just having the foresight of seeing, even though a person may not have the credentials that matches perfectly, do they have the vision? Do they have the skill set and tech wherewithal to adapt and make it work?
So I would say that it's going to be really important for the people making the decisions about the principals to be able to balance the need of bringing in people who have been part of the community for a really long time because they know the context and they know a lot of the people, so they're able to make judgments and plans and ideas that jive with the current way of doing business. But at the same time, it's also critical to bring in principals and others from historically marginalized populations as well. So if they both have the same skill sets, ready and able, willing to lead, then it's going to come down to the mission, the vision, the values. What are you trying to accomplish in the short term, so that way you have the ability to serve all of your students. And then it's also going to be really important that as they're getting ready to come on board, that they really show you that they have a commitment to equity, whether it's equity of access, opportunity, or to historically marginalized populations. But it's also really important that they understand that some students do really well in virtual context and some don't. So how do you support the ones that do, and how do you support the ones that don't? Because moving forward, we have to serve everybody. We have to serve everybody in the virtual environment. So let's make sure that they're successful.
Go ahead, John.
I just have one quick follow-up. It was really great hearing about the real world, the times where this question has come up for both of you. And I wanted to just touch on something that both of you kind of mentioned, and it was that we found while writing the report, and this is one of the recommendations that we make in the report, that leaders can really reference the data systems that they have in place, especially when they're hiring internally for a principal position, just really evaluating the needs of the school that has the vacant position, and then finding the corresponding indicators from teacher data in historical data that's been collected about the applicants, and just making sure that there's an alignment between what we're looking for in those indicators and what our applicants have previously demonstrated in the past. So just a reminder that if your school has these systems and processes in place, that's a great reference point when it comes to hiring.
Thank you. And I now want to open it up for questions outside of my own as facilitator for the panelists. So I'm inviting anyone in the audience to add their questions into either the chat for the Q&A. And as we give folks a chance to think of and type in their questions, I also want to open this opportunity up to our panelists. So if any of our three panelists have questions that they want to pose to the panel in general, or to a specific person on the panel who perhaps has research or lived experience, expertise to share, this is also an opportunity for our panelists to come off mute and pose questions to one another.
So I'd love to hear, where are you recruiting your principals from? And then also, what kind of on-the-job training are you providing them with?
Well, I can tell you that 6 of the last principal vacancies that we've hired have been internal candidates. And we find that just like John talked about, the familiarity with what the expectations are as a district, the knowledge of the community, the knowledge of who and what is the best process to get something done has been really helpful for us. And this has really widened out in terms of who we've hired from our internally. Internally, in the past, we had hired, white males, myself included, 16 years back. And, we have hired more candidates from historically marginalized communities that we have hired as teachers first, and seen the leadership potential, and really, have worked to make sure that they've been mentored and supported from both the district level and from the collective response, co-mentoring that we do with, more experienced principals. So we've been very happy with kind of like a homegrown approach. Our community went from 80% white when I was first hired to 51% white right now, with a large Hispanic community. And we have made it an important piece for us that we've expanded our dual language program from pre-K through 12th grade now. And as a result, we've hired so many more Spanish speaking teachers who have moved up within the ranks, either from a teacher to an instructional leader, from a teacher to an instructional leader to a principal. And it's been a wonderful progression to see. And I think it's given our community, a positive, visible message that, our district will flex who you are as well.
So we haven't had to hire. I'm new. I've been here since July. So the district has not had to hire a principal in 3 years. But with regards to where we're looking, we have a strong pipeline here just in the Burlington area with St. Michael's and with the University of Vermont. But at the same time, I recognize the needs that we need to get out of New England and go to some other places to heavily recruit historically marginalized teachers. And would like to definitely talk offline, Rochelle, about creating a pipeline here, whether it's in my district or for the entire state, because I think we could really, really benefit from the Wallace Foundation's work in creating a bullpen of qualified candidates who have had some strong learning to improve the nature of the principalship and the superintendency in Vermont.
Oh, that's awesome. We have tools and resources and all kinds of things to share. So happy to connect with you. I guess my last question is, what kind of on-the-job support do you need as districts leaders, and have you provided your principals with and your central office staff with? Because what's interesting, right, is that you are the supervisor of central office staff, the supervisor of school-based staff, and everybody has new needs. So what kind of support are you getting? What kind of support are you giving?
I think Digital Promise has been a huge support for us, since our relationship going back, I think it's about 6 or 7 years now, might even be longer. That that network of very innovative, educational leaders has been, I think, a tremendous assistance to us, because it helped put us in a place where we valued that level of innovation. And I think that helped us a lot when we had to switch on, to switch to virtual. But in terms of our support, I think, those associations like Digital Promise, I think our local associations, either as a superintendent or for me, it's the deputy superintendent as well, level, where we're talking constantly about, the challenges each of the districts have faced, so that we can share out either the successes or understandings that we've gleaned from those conversations. I think that's really supportive for us. We ask that our principals do the same thing, that they join their local, for us, it's a county-based association. And that they also go and try to attend whatever conferences they can, where we learn and get to meet from, a wider audience. Something like that, the Digital Promise program and conference is always a great one. I can't wait to get back. And then, because video just doesn't do it, but we'd love to get back and do that in person as well. And then, for us, it's also really important that, you're learning from your community and getting out there. And as Renee talked about, holding town hall so that you have a good pulse of where the community's at.
So in Vermont, within the school district, I'm starting to build in systems where we actually look at data, which hasn't been done as frequently as I would like. So we're working on that. And we're also coming together on what the word equity means as a district. So I'm providing that support there. Now, at large, again, Vermont is very much local control. So the Vermont Principals Association has amazing training offerings that they provide to principals across the state, as well as there are multiple foundations that provide 1 year and 2 year long trainings that they can participate in. But again, since those are external to the district, they're not necessarily aligned to our community's needs. And so that's something that I'm trying to bring back into the fold so that we're all working together under the same mission, vision, and values.
Well, thank you all so much for a really engaging and insightful conversation. Special thank you to our panelists and to the Wallace Foundation for their partnership on the development of this report. The report is available on the Wallace Foundation website. I will drop that in the chat for you. We will also have it posted. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a hard time multitasking. Angela, would you be able to drop that in the chat for me?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. So we will have the report also on the Digital Promise website, along with this recording, which this conversation has really been a wonderful addition to the report. There have been so many new insights shared. So thank you all for your valuable contributions. And we're also hoping that you'll join us for part 2 of this conversation tomorrow, again at 1 p.m. Eastern. Angela, if you could also share that link in the chat, that'd be fantastic. And if you are unable to attend tomorrow, we will post the link to that recording right alongside this one for your future reference. So thank you so much. We appreciate everyone being here today. And we will sign off after this. Have a great afternoon. There's the link to tomorrow's webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you tomorrow.